She told me I wasn't welcome at her wedding, and she said it like she was pushing out a stranger instead of her own father. The words came through the phone sharp and cold, and for a moment I thought I had misheard her. I asked her to repeat it, hoping there was some mistake. But she said it again, slower this time, as if she wanted me to feel every inch of the distance she had placed between us. I remember staring at the wall, trying to understand what I had done that was so terrible. Nothing made sense. One minute we were talking about her plans, and the next she was shutting me out without warning. I tried to ask what changed, but she cut me off with a tone I barely recognized. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to contempt, something taught, not learned. I kept hearing the voice of her fiancé behind her, guiding her words like someone whispering lines into her ear. She spoke fast, almost rehearsed, about wanting a drama-free day, as if my presence alone would ruin everything she imagined. I didn't tell her right then that I had already paid the deposit for the venue. I had done it months earlier when she said they were short on time, and the place might get booked by someone else. I told the coordinator to keep my name off the paperwork because I wanted her to feel proud, not embarrassed, and because helping her was something I had always done quietly. I never expected it to be used against me. The longer she talked, the more I realized the decision wasn't hers alone. She kept mentioning how he thinks it's best and how we want to move forward without extra stress. She once asked me for advice about everything, but now she sounded like she was reading from a script someone else wrote. Every sentence carried a hint of someone else's judgment. I felt something shifting under my feet, as if a part of my life had moved without warning. She didn't ask why my voice broke, and she didn't pause when I went silent, trying to gather myself. She just kept talking, firm and distant, like she was closing a door I didn't know was open behind me. I tried to tell myself she was overwhelmed or scared, but the truth settled heavier with every second. There was more beneath her words, something hidden and shaped by money, pressure, or promises I had never heard her make before. By the end of the call, I couldn't even feel anger. I only felt a deep confusion, like the ground of our relationship had cracked in places I had ignored for years. When the call ended, the quiet in my house felt colder than it had any right to be. And I sat there wondering something I never thought I'd ask. Would you still help a child who tells you to stay away? I paid the deposit because she asked for help in a voice that trembled between hope and fear, the way she used to when life felt too heavy for her to hold alone. She told me the venue needed the money fast or they would lose the date, and she didn't want to start her future, feeling like she had already failed. I didn't think twice. A father steps in when his child stumbles, even when she's grown and convinced she doesn't need him. I told her I would take care of it, and she thanked me in a whisper that sounded grateful at the time. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. When I called the venue, the coordinator recognized her name right away. She said they were happy someone was helping the young couple because they were clearly overwhelmed. I could hear the pressure in her voice, the kind that comes when deadlines close in. She walked me through the payment process, slow and patient, making sure I understood every part. I asked her to leave my name off the paperwork. I told myself it was for my daughter's confidence, not for any credit. The coordinator paused, then agreed, saying she understood how family support sometimes needed to stay quiet. I didn't realize how that choice would be twisted later. The day I made the payment, I sent my daughter a short message telling her it was done. She replied with a heart emoji and a quick "thank you." It was simple, almost rushed, but I didn't think much of it. I thought she was busy planning her life. I didn't know she was also planning her distance. Looking back now, I can see how her tone changed over the weeks that followed. She grew harder to reach. Calls that once lasted an hour turned into 5-minute check-ins that felt like she was talking from another room. Whenever I brought up the wedding, she answered with clipped phrases as if the subject annoyed her. I tried to ignore the shift, thinking she was just stressed. But something about her didn't feel like the daughter I raised. There were signs I missed. Little remarks about how he thinks we should handle things differently, or how he wants us to be more independent. At the time, I thought independence meant growing up. Now I understand it meant pushing me out in slow, steady steps. Every conversation felt like she was being pulled away, guided by someone with an interest in keeping me at a distance. I didn't see the grooming for what it was. I didn't realize my help had become a tool they could use quietly while pretending they were building everything on their own. And when she told me I wasn't welcome, it became clear that someone wanted my support, not my presence. That truth settled into me like a weight I couldn't put down. And I knew then that the deposit wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a pattern I had ignored for far too long. I first noticed the change in her voice during a short call on a Thursday evening. She spoke in a tone that felt trimmed down, as if every word had been approved before she let it leave her mouth. There was no warmth, no natural flow. It was cold, controlled, almost rehearsed. When I asked how she was doing, she answered like someone completing a form, giving me just enough to keep the conversation moving, but never enough to feel real. I remember pausing, listening closely, trying to hear the daughter I knew behind the stiffness. But she wasn't there. It was like talking to a stranger who happened to sound like her. The longer we talked, the more I heard someone else in the room. A faint whisper, a suggestion, a quiet prompt. And then she started repeating phrases that were not hers. We need boundaries. I want a clean start. You tend to take over. These weren't her words. They were planted lines, fed to her by someone who had a clear purpose. I asked her what she meant by take over, and she stumbled for a second before saying, "He thinks you sometimes make decisions for me." That was when I realized the groom was speaking through her, shaping her view of me without ever addressing me directly. It only got worse from there. If I suggested helping with something small, she would snap back with, "I don't need you controlling everything," even though I wasn't controlling anything. If I asked about the wedding, she would twist it into an accusation about me adding stress. The daughter who once asked for my advice now acted like my presence alone was a burden she had to carry. Each conversation felt like walking across broken glass, trying not to cut myself while she stood on the other end, telling me I was the one making a mess. A family friend, Linda, called me after running into her at the grocery store. Linda said my daughter barely made eye contact and rushed through the conversation like she had something to hide. She also mentioned the groom answering questions meant for her, stepping in with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Something's off," Linda said. She didn't look free. Hearing that from someone else made the shift feel even heavier. I wasn't imagining it. Other people could see the distance forming. The more I replayed these moments, the more I began to fear what was happening behind closed doors. Her new tone wasn't just emotional distance. It was guided, shaped, influenced by someone who benefited from pushing me further out of her life. And when money began slipping into the picture, little hints about expenses, comments about financial stress, and questions about what I could help with, the truth became harder to ignore. It wasn't just emotional change. It was strategy. Someone wanted access to what I could give, not to who I was. And that realization settled into me with a grief deeper than anything I expected to face as a father. I started by going through my bank records, something I rarely did in detail. I wanted to see the exact date I paid the deposit, hoping it would calm the unease growing inside me. Instead, it pulled me deeper into a feeling I didn't want to name. The charge was there, clear as day, but right beneath it sat another unfamiliar transaction tied to the same venue. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how there could be two charges linked to one booking. When I finally called the venue, the coordinator reminded me that someone had asked about adding coverage for extra services 2 weeks after I paid. She assumed it was me. It wasn't. Her voice changed when I told her that. She pulled up the file and quietly explained that my daughter's fiancé had inquired about additional payments. Payments, he said, would be handled by her father, since he already stepped in once. I felt my throat tighten as she spoke. That was the moment the suspicion I'd been avoiding finally took shape. They hadn't just accepted my help. They expected it, counted on it, and planned around it without telling me. I spent the rest of that afternoon going through messages with my daughter, trying to see if she ever mentioned needing more funds, but she hadn't. What I did find were small hints I missed. The groom's comments about how weddings can get expensive, and her sudden silence whenever finances came up. I remembered how distant she became right after I paid the deposit. Back then, I thought it was stress. Now it felt like they had gotten what they wanted and were deciding how to ask for more without revealing the truth. The next day, I met with a financial advisor I trusted, someone who had helped me through my retirement planning. I showed her the records and explained the situation without adding emotion. She listened carefully, then said something that made my stomach drop. "It looks like they were positioning you as a silent payer." She explained that some people, especially manipulative partners, target older family members, knowing they can be generous and trusting. They keep the support hidden so they can take credit publicly while using the elder behind the scenes. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest as she spoke. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. After our meeting, I called the venue again to confirm the timeline. Every detail lined up with the advisor's concern. The groom had been planning for me to cover more costs, and they had no intention of mentioning my involvement to anyone. They wanted my money, not my presence. By the time evening fell, the truth stood in front of me without room for excuses. This was not an emotional conflict or a clash of personalities. It was financial exploitation, plain, quiet, and intentional. And once I saw it clearly, I knew things were about to change in ways none of us could undo. The lawyer didn't rush me. That was the first sign I had finally come to the right place. She sat across from me in a quiet office with soft lighting and shelves full of case files, and she listened without interrupting. I told her everything. How my daughter shut me out, how the groom whispered through her, how the venue deposit had been taken quietly, and how more charges appeared without my knowledge. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the anger beneath everything pushed against my words. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "You were right to come here." She explained things in simple terms, the kind meant for someone who needed clarity more than comfort. She said the venue deposit legally counted as either a gift or a loan, depending on what was discussed. If I had messages showing I paid it out of support because they couldn't afford it, that leaned toward a loan. If I never intended for them to repay me, it leaned toward a gift. But either way, she said the bigger issue wasn't the deposit, it was the pattern. She talked about financial coercion, the way someone can pressure an older parent into offering help while pushing them out of the family circle. She explained how emotional abuse often pairs with financial control, especially when a new partner wants influence or access to resources without dealing with the elder who provides them. Every word she spoke felt like she was reading pages I didn't know had been written about my own life. She wasn't surprised by anything I told her. That hurt more than I expected. I asked her if what they did was wrong in the eyes of the law. She looked at me with a serious expression and said, "It is wrong in every way that matters. And depending on what we find, it may also be illegal." She told me to gather every document I had. Bank statements, messages, emails, screenshots of conversations, anything confirming what I paid. She also suggested writing down dates while the details were still fresh. "Memory changes," she said. "Paper doesn't." Then she leaned back and told me something I hadn't heard from anyone yet. "You're not overreacting. You're being exploited." Those words settled into me heavier than any accusation I could have imagined. Hearing it from a professional didn't ease the pain. It sharpened it. It confirmed that my daughter's coldness wasn't emotional confusion. It was calculated distance, shaped by someone who wanted control over the financial support I offered. She explained the steps we could take, all in plain language. Filing a record of concern, establishing proof of financial involvement, and preparing affidavits. She said these actions didn't mean a lawsuit, but they protected me if things escalated. They also created a trail showing I was being isolated and used. For the first time since everything began, I felt a sense of direction. Not hope, but clarity. When I left her office, I carried the weight of her words with me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a family argument. It was exploitation, intentional, targeted, and cloaked in the language of independence and boundaries. And I knew then that the only way forward was through the truth, no matter how painful it would be. Would you consider legal steps if this happened to you? I found the truth on a night when sleep wouldn't come. I sat at my kitchen table with every document, message, and receipt spread out in front of me. I told myself I was only double-checking the facts the lawyer asked for. But part of me knew I was looking for something deeper. Something that explained how my own daughter could shut me out so easily. What I found didn't ease anything. It only broke what was left of my hope. Buried in her old messages was a screenshot she had once sent me by accident months earlier. At the time, I barely looked at it because she claimed it was meant for someone else. Now, reading it again with fresh eyes, I saw the groom's name at the top and a line that froze me in place. "He'll pay for the deposit. Just act surprised when he mentions it." My hands shook as I zoomed in, reading the words over and over. In that one message, their plan was written as clearly as ink could allow. He had been coaching her long before the wedding stress began. I kept looking through their shared transactions, the ones linked to their joint folders she once let me access when she needed help budgeting. Most files were innocent, lists, schedules, vendor notes. But then I saw a line item labeled Dad Support, the only one typed in bold. Next to it were numbers, expectations, categories of things they assumed I would cover because he always steps in. It was like reading a shopping list of my own generosity, turned into something cold and strategic. Later that week, she called me out of nowhere. Her tone was tight, as if she was preparing for a test. Every sentence she spoke sounded coached. She said things like, "We need to build our own foundation," and "He thinks it's time we handle things without outside influence." Those weren't her words. They were his thoughts, fed to her, repeated back to me with a stiffness that hurt more than if she had shouted at me. I didn't argue. I waited until she finished. Then I told her what I had found, my voice steady, my breathing slow. I explained the screenshot, the financial folder, the venue records. I told her how the lawyer described the pattern and how every detail pointed to manipulation wrapped in polite language. I didn't accuse her. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid the facts between us like a quiet truth she couldn't ignore. For a moment, there was silence. Then she gave a small, shaky breath and said, "You weren't supposed to see any of that." The words hit harder than anything else she had said to me. Not because she denied it, but because she admitted it without hesitation. She knew. She had chosen to follow his lead because it made her life easier. Because letting me pay in secret meant they could look independent in public. Standing there with the phone pressed to my ear, I felt something inside me split. Not from anger, but from understanding. She hadn't chosen honesty or family. She had chosen convenience and the man who promised her a future built on appearances, not truth. That was the moment everything became clear. I wasn't losing her to marriage. I had already lost her to manipulation long before the wedding day arrived. The morning of the wedding felt heavier than any storm I had lived through. I sat alone in my living room while the sun climbed through the blinds, knowing my daughter was putting on her dress somewhere across town. I imagined the music, the chatter, the cameras, all moving forward without any trace of me. There was no seat reserved, no space left open, not even a quiet thought spared for the father who had once carried her on his shoulders. I told myself I had prepared for this day. But when the hour finally came, the grief rose in my chest like a slow tide, steady and cold. I didn't turn on the TV or the radio. I wanted the silence. I needed it to understand the shape of what had been taken from me. Watching her walk down the aisle should have been a moment I held on to for the rest of my life. But instead, it became something I had to accept as lost. The house felt unfamiliar that morning, as if it belonged to someone who had lived a different life. One where a daughter still cared enough to want her father close. Late in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was the venue coordinator. She apologized for calling on the wedding day, but said the couple still had an outstanding balance that needed to be addressed by the person listed as the original payer. At first, her words didn't register. Then she repeated it. The contract linked to the deposit had my name attached to it, and because of that, I was being contacted about the remaining charges. I gave her my lawyer's number and ended the call before the weight of that truth settled fully. I wasn't at the wedding, yet somehow I was still part of the business behind it. A silent provider tied to a celebration I had been pushed out of. My lawyer called an hour later. She said she had spoken to the venue and explained that no further charges were authorized by me. She then issued formal notices stating that any attempt to use my financial information without consent would carry legal consequences. Hearing her speak with such certainty brought a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't invisible. The truth had a way of pulling itself forward. By the next day, the fallout began. My daughter called first, her voice tight and unsteady. She asked why the venue was saying the deposit came from me. She claimed she didn't know, but I could hear panic in her breath. The groom got on the line, trying to sound controlled, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his tone when he realized the paper trail pointed straight back to me. They thought everything had been buried beneath secrecy and scripted words. They were wrong. My daughter didn't admit to anything. She danced around the truth as if naming it would force her to face what she had done. She said the coordinator must be confused, and that this was not the time for drama. But every excuse she gave only showed how tightly they had held onto their story, hoping I would never find the cracks. I ended the call without anger, without comfort, and without giving her the lie she wanted to hear. There was no reconciliation waiting at the end of this. No warm moment to soften the damage. The truth had finally stood on its own, and its weight was enough to bring their entire plan into the light. I learned something in the quiet days after the wedding, something I should have understood long before any invitations were sent out. Betrayal doesn't grow out of a single moment. It grows out of character. It shows you who someone becomes when pressure, pride, and opportunity meet in the same room. My daughter didn't push me away because she was overwhelmed. She pushed me away because it was easier to accept help without accepting the person who gave it. I spent many nights sitting alone, thinking about what support should look like between a parent and an adult child. Support is meant to be shared with honesty. It should never be taken in silence or twisted into something secret. It should never come with shame or be buried to protect someone's image. And it should never cost a parent their dignity or their place in their own child's life. I realized I had given more than money. I had given trust. That was the part they spent the fastest. In the weeks that followed, I set boundaries I should have set earlier. Emotional boundaries first, reminding myself I could care without sacrificing my worth. Then financial boundaries, locking accounts, securing documents, and refusing to discuss money without clear purpose and written agreement. And finally, legal boundaries. Keeping every record the lawyer advised, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I understood now that people who hide your help will never protect your name when it matters most. There were moments when grief hit harder than anger ever did. I didn't just lose a seat at her wedding. I lost the version of her I had carried in my heart for years, the one who ran to me when she was scared, the one who trusted me without question. Accepting that meant letting go of the illusion that love alone can hold a family together. Sometimes love has to step aside so truth can take its place. I stopped asking myself what I did wrong. The lawyer helped me see the pattern. The documents showed the intent. And the silence after the fallout confirmed everything I needed to know. They hadn't just used my support. They had counted on my silence. But silence is a choice, and I finally chose to break mine. Standing on my porch one evening, I felt a kind of strength I hadn't known during the chaos. Not pride, not victory, just clarity. A clear understanding that respecting myself mattered as much as loving my child, and sometimes even more. I realized dignity isn't something anyone can take unless you hand it over. I won't hand it over again. So I leave the story in your hands now. Not because I want sympathy, but because this question belongs to more than just me. Would you forgive a child who used your kindness and erased you from the most important day of their life?